Thank you very much for your talk tonight. I'd like to say that it seems to me that initially you speak about why is there something rather than nothing. Suggests to me that philosophically the answer lies for you in the will of God, ultimately, for creation. So essentially I want to ask a question which I need you to decide whether it's theological or philosophical. But you speak of free will, and free will seems to be fundamental to the Christian notion of creation, to the Christian experience following creation. I'd just like to ask, seeing as each person has an existence brought into being by God and the will of God and God's creative act, and free will is so fundamental to God's act of creation, that initial bringing into being is a compulsory existence. So in terms of every person's existence and the fact that it is morally accountable, could you just say something about your philosophical position in terms of God's creative act and the bringing into being of morally accountable, what should we say, creatures that are therefore accountable but are compulsorily existing?
All right, let me try to address that. First, the way in which we have tried to answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is not by an appeal to God's will. Rather, the appeal is to God Himself as a metaphysically necessary being. The reason that there is something rather than nothing is because there is a metaphysically necessary being whose non-existence is impossible, a being who exists in all possible worlds. So the word something here doesn't mean just the universe. The reason the universe exists, yes, is because of the will of God, but the reason anything exists is because there is a metaphysically necessary being, which is God Himself. And then you're quite right. In Christian theology, creation is a freely willed choice of God. He did not have to create. He was under no compulsion or obligation to create. Creation is a free act of God. He brought the universe into being without any material cause. Now, you're also, I think, right in saying that we didn't ask to be created. And in that sense, we do find ourselves thrust into existence. There is that sort of compulsion, as you put it. I didn't ask to be born. I just find myself here. And this is a profound philosophical question that many philosophers have struggled with. Why do I exist? And the answer, I think, is quite right, that God has created me. He has decided that I should exist and has put me into existence. And so I do find myself, in a sense, thrust into being. Here I am now. What am I going to do with my life? And as you also indicated, God has created you as a moral agent. That is to say, you have the freedom to make morally significant choices in a way that mere animals do not. And therefore, you are morally accountable to God as a holy and just Creator for the way you choose to live your life. And the sad news is that all of us have failed to live up to His holy and moral standards. We have in various ways said or thought or done things that are evil, that are contrary to God's will. And as a result, we find ourselves in need of His grace and forgiveness and moral reformation in our lives. And that gets into then the whole Christian gospel of redemption and salvation through Christ, who is God's provision for our sin. But all of this is based upon the idea that we are, as you say, morally significant agents capable of freely choosing to obey or to disobey God.
Thank you. I'm not trying to raise this as any proof against any of the claims for God's existence, but I am, as a philosopher, also a teacher, essentially.
Yes.
Often in conversation with students who may come across Dostoevsky's telling novel, which brings to the point this situation of somebody as if they've been given by God a ticket to existence, and in a sense they want to return the ticket. How come? And I know that this is essentially, it sounds very ungrateful, but it is an ethical issue and a philosophical issue that raises the question of the irreversible nature of those significant moral choices we make, which we didn't instigate. So I wondered if you could say, how might I tell my students, for example, that God is not just that he has the power or the authority. I don't think we need to question that if we take God as a necessary being that has authority.
Yes.
But the question is, in a sense, how can God hold to account and ultimately make people or expect people to pay for their actions that they didn't ask? Can I give you a very naive analogy? And possibly the analogy will fail. But if, for example, you as a child were asked to enter an egg and spoon race, in fact, put into an egg and spoon race, maybe you don't have these in America, but we suffer these things in England. Some kind of arbitrary and possibly non-necessary race for maybe a reason that you've no idea yourself. As a child, you enter a race, you're put into it, and you fail the race and you suffer some punishment. There's a sense in which we would regard that as unjust. How might I tell my students it's not unjust for God to bring us into being and to make us accountable for our being?
All right, well, there's a number of levels on which you can answer that question. First of all, I would argue that it makes no sense to even talk about justice apart from God and his commands. Our moral obligations, I think, are constituted by God's commands to us. So that it's the very concept of justice means something that is in accord with the will and commands of a holy and loving God. So the very concept of justice, I think, is rooted in God and his commands. I think the other thing to keep in mind that these students may not appreciate is what I said to the other questioner earlier tonight, and that is that creation is a tremendous gift. It is for our benefit. We are being given the opportunity to come into relationship with infinite goodness and love, the source of all moral value whatsoever. To know God is an incommensurable good. That is to say, there's literally nothing that can be compared to it. Finite goods cannot even be compared to the infinite good of knowing God. So that those of us who have been created out of all the possible individuals God could have created are the beneficiaries of an indescribable gift, the gift of existence and the chance to know God, infinite goodness and love forever. And that's why they shouldn't want to return the ticket. They should be rejoicing in their good fortune that God has chosen to create them and give them this unspeakable gift.